FRS is prepared to reposition stamp duties as next major revenue source for Nigeria. As revenue from oil and gas continues to dwindle due to global fall in demand and price of petroleum products, indirect taxes such as stamp duty remain the viable and sustainable alternative revenue source for funding budgetary requirements by the Nigerian government.
This administration has resolved to widen the revenue base by activating the stamp duty revenue collection, which has been neglected for more than 20 years. There is assurance that the collection from stamp duty will be second to oil revenue, as it has the potential to yield up to 1 trillion naira revenue annually if properly harnessed.
Yes, stamp duties as the successor to oil as Nigeria's major revenue earner. Welcome to Tax Matters. I'm Chamaka Ohauchi. We recall that a few episodes ago, we told you that in order to bring you up to speed with regard to matters relating to stamp duties, we have spoken to some tax officials and tax advisors from the public and private sectors. To get a private sector perspective on this trending matter of stamp duties, we spoke to Mr. TAIWO Oyedele, Fiscal Policy Partner and West African Tax Leader at PwC. Mr. Oyedele spoke to our Muyiwama Tuluku. But before then, some taxation news. Nigeria is set to begin the exchange of financial accounts information with treaty partners. All relevant legislations have been enacted. Installation of required ICT infrastructure is nearing completion, and the reporting financial institutions are expected to file their first reports by September 30, 2020. To make this happen, a series of meetings have been held with reporting entities, including money deposit banks, asset management companies, life assurance companies, security trading firms, among others, as well as their tax advisors, with a view to educating them on automatic exchange of information legal provisions, the reporting process, and the use of common reporting standards infrastructure. Now to Mr. Oyedele.
Mr. Oyedele, thank you for joining us on Tax Matters.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
The principal legislation for stamp duty dates back to 1939, 80 years ago. So why do you think it has taken this long to implement the law?
I'll say as a country, maybe we lost the, our sentiments and the appetite for tax matters when we discovered oil. Because to be honest, in the 30s, nobody would say they were not paying stamp duty. It was one of the top taxes in those early days. As we discover oil, we became complacent. And then on top of that, there was the concern that Nigerians, started having around corruption, about the use of public resources. And this combined effect meant that people lost interest in tax matters. So, and therefore, we went to sleep. But now that we're being woken up by the realities we face today, and COVID is one of them, but it's not only COVID. We had those issues even before COVID-19 came on board. We're now beginning to realize that actually the only way that is sustainable for us to run our economy and provide for our people is through taxes. So government is now taking a second look at so many things, including those that they have ignored for so long, including stamp duties. I'll say, for example, certain agencies like the Corporate Affairs Commission have been very diligent. For as long as I've been in practice, the CAC would always collect stamp duty when you want to authorize share capital for your company and a few other transactions you have with them. So for them, they never went to sleep. But overall, I think it's a wake-up call now for Nigeria.
The federal government, the Federal Inland Revenue Service, especially now under the leadership of Mr. Muhammad Nami, has expressed its determination to make stamp duties the next black gold, that is a worthy successor to oil as Nigeria's major revenue earner. What do you make of this?
Thank you very much. Maybe I should start by giving some context in terms of the background to the stamp duty as we know it today.
Yes.
So it's a tax that is based on the Stamp Duties Act of 2004, LFN 2004, but really it was enacted based on the Ordinance 41 of 1939. So you would imagine that this is a very old piece of legislation.
Yeah.
Was amended by the Finance Act 2019 that was signed into law earlier on in the year, in January. And some of the changes introduced by the Finance Act include making the Federal Inland Revenue Service the appropriate authority to administer the law, impose, collect, account for revenue collected under the law. And that same amendment also gives the authority to collect at the state level to the State Internal Revenue Service. Before then, the Stamp Duties Act contained provision that says government, so which means it could be federal government, it could be state government, and it did not mention the revenue agencies specifically. The other amendment that was introduced by the Finance Act was to do with electronic instruments. Before now, it was mostly about written documents that were liable to stamp duties. And then we also have the exemption that was granted on bank transfer if the amount we were transferring was less than 10,000 naira. So in terms of the mode of stamping, stamp duty that is payable can be denoted by impress or adhesive stamp. So, this one that you press, like for a seal of a company, you press and you see it. And then the adhesive stamp is, just like a stamp, you put it on it, it's gum, there's gum underneath. So those are the forms for denoting stamp duty. The Finance Act of 2019 again introduced a new form, which is the electronic stamping. So the rate of stamp duty you pay can be what we call a fixed charge, which means it's the same amount regardless of the value of the transaction or the number of pages of the document. It could also be ad valorem, which means that it's a function of the value of the contract, consideration, or the transaction. Now, to your question around whether this can be the black gold, I'll say, well, in a way, I think that, if we do everything right as a country, combined federal and state, we should be able to raise maybe over 1 trillion naira in a year from stamp duties. But I'm not sure that I would call it the black gold, because if you think about 1 trillion, it's significant, but in terms of where Nigeria needs to be, in terms of revenue generation, that will not get us there. So I'll still say, like the IMF said recently, that we should not be thinking about raising new taxes. We should rather focus on efficiency of collection. And I share that sentiment of the IMF, because if you think about countries like South Africa, they generate more revenue from personal income tax alone than all the taxes that we generate in Nigeria by federal level, states, local government, oil, non-oil related, from only personal income tax.
As an individual or as a corporate body, why do I need to stamp my document? Why should I pay stamp duty? What is in it for me?
Yes, I understand. I think the same reason why you want to pay your taxes. And that reason is because it's a social contract. It's your civic duty. As an individual, as a responsible organization, you have to comply with tax obligations, because that is the only way we can have a country. We need that resources for us to run our economy, to provide infrastructure, to take care of the vulnerable people in our society, and so on and so forth. And I know that many of our listeners will be saying, well, but we don't get all of those things. But the reality is, even with COVID-19, we have seen that countries who thrive on tax revenue are better able to cope with the challenges of COVID-19. They're able to administer palliatives to their people. We see countries like the US where they didn't need to start looking for who was vulnerable. They just, from their tax record, they could tell, and they just credited their accounts. So I think that that's the most fundamental reason why, as an individual or a company, you have to be willing to pay your taxes. The other thing is that if you then don't pay, there are penalties. So there are penalties under the Stamp Duties Act. There are penalties under the FRS Establishment Act. And those penalties can be as high as 10% interest rate. It could also be higher than that if you apply the FRS Establishment Act, and you could also have, imprisonment for up to 3 years. So my encouragement is, when you are liable to taxes pay, even if you don't like it, you can then use another method to try and go and talk to your representative at the National Assembly to make the changes that you want.
We've also had some people talking about the fact that when you stamp duty a document, so to say, pardon that phrase, that it makes the document or instrument justiciable, in the sense that if a dispute arises on an agreement, that if stamp duty has been paid, if the document is stamped, then the court will recognize the document. Is that a consideration at all?
Yes, that's correct. But I think that many people, when they enter into transaction, they don't think about the fact that things can go wrong. So in a civil case, if you haven't stamped your document, it will not be admissible as an evidence in a civil proceeding. But what tends to happen is a lot of people will then go and stamp it at that point when they need to tender it as an evidence. So I would not say it's the biggest reason why people pay, but I think it's one of the considerations. And people have to also, why they hope for the best in their arrangements, particularly commercial arrangements, they should also prepare for the worst, which could be that you may need to go to court and you need to tender this document as an evidence. Therefore, you have to stamp duty it.
We understand that stamp duty is collectible by both the Federal Inland Revenue Service and the State Boards of Internal Revenue. Would you want to enlighten our viewers as to the jurisdiction of the two levels of government?
That's a very good question. Yeah. So the Stamp Duties Act gave the powers about who collects stamp duties to the government. In the case of a transaction involving a company, it gave that to the federal government. And in the case of transactions involving individuals like you and I, if we enter into a transaction now, then it gave that to the state government.
Okay.
So what the Finance Act has done now is to now go ahead and mention the agency that should do it on behalf of the federal government and the agency that should do it on behalf of the state government. So in other words, if you have any transaction today, if you're a tenant and you then go into a tenancy arrangement with your landlord and you're both individuals, you pay to the state tax authority. But if a company is involved, then that's within the jurisdiction of the FRS.
Thank you very much. Would you be kind enough to share with us some of the chargeable instruments and the applicable rates?
So like I said earlier on, the rate for stamp duty can be either fixed duty rate, which means it's the same regardless of whether the amount is big or small, and then there's ad valorem. Under the fixed duty instrument, you have things like guarantor's form, loan agreement, trust deed, memorandum of association, articles of association, including a will, and also dividend warrant for those who are shareholders, and proxy cards. All of these carry stamp duty at 500 naira for the original copy, and then if you want more copies or counterpart copies, you pay 50 naira. Now, for the ad valorem, these are the ones who are based on, these ones are based on the percentage of the consideration under the agreement. So some of these include insurance policies. So that's 1 naira 50 kobo on every 2,000 naira. You can say is 0.075%. There's share capital. If you authorize your share capital or you increase your share capital, is 0.75%. Bill of sale is 1.5%. If you have contract relating to shares or loans from an insurance company, is 0.375%. For lease agreements involving plant and machinery, you can also lease an asset other than a property. That one is 0.78%. For contract agreement, it is 1%. For deed of assignment and confirmation ratification, is 1.5%. Now, I think this next one will be interesting to our viewers, and that's to do with leasehold agreement and tenancy agreement. So what the law says is that if the tenure of your agreement is less than 7 years, 0 to 7 years, you pay 0.78%. And if your tenancy is more than 7 years, over 7 years, but not more than 21 years, you pay 3%. If the tenancy agreement is more than 21 years, you pay 6%. I see that there has been a lot of misunderstanding in the public space because people have been under the impression that all rent agreements will be 6%. So it's not. It depends on the tenor of the agreement. And then the last one I should mention is to do with immovable property. That is 0.75%. So these are some of the rates under the Stamp Duties Act.
Let us add that the stamp duties rates currently in the public domain were actually fixed by the Joint Tax Board at its meeting in Birni Kebbi in May 2002 and took effect from July 1st, 2002. But it does seem that the FRS has been left to take the flak. Well, call it the price of leadership. Back to Mr. Oyedele.
Let's talk about the obligations of parties with regard to stamp duty. Who bears the burden? Who collects? Who remits? For example, in the case of tenancy agreement, who bears the burden? Is it the tenant or the landlord?
Yeah. So this law, like we said, is a law of 1939. In fact, I think it was even before 1939 originally enacted, like maybe 1923. So it's a very old law. For some reasons, it is not very clear about who is responsible. It's generally silent about a responsible party. But usually, it is the beneficiary in an arrangement or the person who is making a payment that has the obligation to pay stamp duties. If you also read the Stamp Duties Act, you can make some inferences about who is supposed to be liable because the Stamp Duty Act prescribes penalties in certain cases and it says you should pay penalties. So we think that whoever the law says will be liable for not stamping the document means that that person has the obligation. So in the case of a tenancy agreement, the law says that the liability of not stamping it will rest with the lessee, that's the tenant. So the tenant, therefore, being the one that is liable for not paying, must be the one who is liable to make the payment. But the FRS and the state tax authorities have also, by way of their publication, appointed the landlords to be their agent to then collect the stamp duty from the tenant and pay to the relevant tax authority, which could be FRS or State Internal Revenue Service. Most time is the lawyer of the landlord that will prepare the agreement. So therefore, the landlord should ask the tenant to pay the stamp duty, and then the landlord should not keep the stamp duty for himself or herself. Should remit it to the relevant tax authority. So it's the obligation of the lessee, but the lessor, who is the landlord, should collect it.
Enforcement is one of the pillars of tax administration. How do you think the Federal Inland Revenue Service, the FRS, and the State Internal Revenue Services can enforce stamp duty obligations?
Yes. So I think in terms of the enforcement, I would say that the authorities, both FRS and the state tax authorities, have to start with very aggressive education and awareness. And I'll give the credit to the FRS. They've created a lot of awareness in a very short period of time. We also need a lot of stakeholder engagement, particularly the people who act as your agents. A lot of them are institutions. And then you need capacity building for your officers, and you need tax intelligence. So if I rent, a flat from you, most likely I'll pay the money into your bank account. It's not likely that I'll bring a lot of cash and pay you in cash. And even if I pay you in cash, you take it to the bank or somehow, a lot of it will get into the financial system. So that intelligence can help. And also when people are filling their tax returns, your personal tax returns, you need to declare stuff around rent. So we can connect the dots and pick areas where stamp duty should have been paid and then enforce compliance. But I think we need to get to a point where we can get people to voluntarily comply, because that's less costly for the tax authorities. So you spend less of your effort and resources in trying to chase people around for enforcement. But I also say that the authorities should not think about going back in time. If you want to start doing back duty assessment, it will make the resistance even harder.
Let's go back to the applicable rates. Would you say that the rates chargeable for stamp duties in Nigeria are comparable to what operates in the West African sub-region or in Europe or the Americas?
So what tends to happen is that every country tends to have a lot of nominal rates for stamp duties, and then they focus their stamp duty ad valorem on large value items that will not create distortion to the economy. So clearly, because the Stamp Duty Act in Nigeria is a very old piece of legislation, I'll go back to the rent example I gave before. In fact, that law in 1939 says that if you rent a house and your rent in a year is less than 50 naira, your rate is even much lower than what I said before. And if your rent is more than 50 naira, so you can imagine 50 naira at the time, maybe it's about 200,000 naira today. So, and some of the penalties are 20 kobo, 20 naira. So clearly, there's a need for us to update to bring it into reality. Some of the rates need to be adjusted. But while adjusting it, we need to be mindful of the poorest people in society so they don't bear the burden of those rates. So let the rate fall on people who have the ability to pay so that the tax is not regressive overall.
I must say that you have already gone into the realm of recommendations and advice. And while you are at that, what we want to know from you, what needs to be done at both the level of the FRS and the State Internal Revenue Services to ensure that we get it right, so that when we look back 2-3 years from now, we can say, yes, we have indeed been able to raise the revenue profile of the country with stamp duties as a major collection.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll say the first step that has been taken is very good, which is now putting the mandate for the collection of the stamp duty at the doorstep of the tax authority. So that's the right thing to do. And I know there has been a lot of confusion in the public space about the role of NIFOs. And my honest truth is that a postage stamp is not the same thing as stamp duty. And therefore, the FRS has produced their own adhesive stamp. Overall, making the tax authority to be the appropriate authority is a very good first step. The next thing is I would like to see where the tax authorities are able to push for a reenactment of the law so that, I don't think it's a law that we should be passing. So if you have a car that is very old and you keep replacing the engine today, the door tomorrow, the fan bed the day after, it doesn't solve your problem. Maybe you just need to buy a new car. So we need to reenact it and limit to fewer items. Some of the items there, nobody, is doing those transactions anymore. And those that are easy to collect, we focus on them and redesign it so that it aligns with global best practice and the current reality that we have in Nigeria. We also need, like I said before, to ensure that it is not regressive. And most importantly, we utilize it efficiently for the benefit of the people, and we are accountable to the people. So once we create the awareness, the sensitization, and people think that we are accountable for how the money will be spent, I think we get the buy-in. And then particularly the institutions and government agencies that are collecting these taxes, they should not be collecting the money and just be keeping it or spending it against the law. The money should be remitted to the federation accounts, shared to the levels of government, so that we have more money to take care of our people, of our society, and to develop infrastructure and human capital development.
We thank you most sincerely for sharing your thoughts with us on stamp duty. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
This kind of nonsense has to end today. Why would the bank be removing somebody's money every time like that?
Mr. John.
My neighbor!
Yes, sir. Why are you rushing to like this?
Can you imagine? I just sent money to my son and I got a debit alert of 15 naira from my bank as stamp duty. I am going to seek explanation from my bank because I made a transfer, not post a letter.
Mr. John, let me explain what stamp duty is. Stamp duty is not all about postage stamp matters. The 15 naira is a stamp duty levy charged by banks on customers who make transfers of 10,000 naira and above from one bank account to another bank account.
And why should I pay stamp duty for my hard-earned money?
Mr. John, paying stamp duty levy is a civic duty for every patriotic citizen. The taxes we all pay are collected and used by the government to pay salaries and provide basic amenities for citizens. It's even easier to make stamp duty payments now. All you need to do as a taxpayer is to log on to the following: www.stampduty.gov.ng or www.firs.gov.ng and click on e-stamping. By the way, Mr. John, it pays to pay your tax,
Oh, thank you very much.
Sir.
Thank you, my daughter.
You're welcome,
My
sir.
regards to your family.
All right, sir.
This broadcast is powered by FIRS, Federal Inland Revenue Service.
We do hope that once again we have been able to further educate and enlighten you on this all-important matter. Next episode, we'll return to the revenue officials. Mrs. Tolu Akpomedaye, the state coordinator of the FIRS Lagos Mainland West, will be our guest. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.